Welcome back to the deep dive. I want to start today by actually asking you to check your ego at the door because we are about to dismantle a concept that I think, well, most of us use as a compliment.
Right. It's a big one.
Yeah, we're looking at survival of the fittest. And when you say that phrase to yourself, you probably picture the Olympic athlete or maybe the genius billionaire or the apex predator.
The lion on the savannah.
Exactly, the lion. We just naturally equate fitness with being the best, the strongest, the healthiest, or even the most noble.
It is the standard assumption. I mean, we tend to moralize evolution. We look at the winners of history or, the winners of the corporate ladder, and we assume that because they survived, they must be good or superior in some objective sense.
We assume the system filters for quality.
Right.
But looking at the stack of research we have for today, that definition isn't just slightly off, it might be completely backwards. In fact, the sources suggest it's the exact opposite of how evolution actually works.
That is the core premise we are tackling here. If you look at the source material, which ranges from evolutionary biology to some pretty dense sociology, the one thing they all agree on is this: fitness is value neutral.
Value neutral.
Yes. It is not a moral category. It isn't even a health category.
Which is really just a polite academic way of saying evolution doesn't care if you're a good person.
It goes further than that, actually. Evolution doesn't even care if you are a healthy person. In the strictest biological sense, and we will definitely see how this applies to your office job later, fitness simply means fitting into a hole.
Like a puzzle piece.
Think of it exactly like a puzzle. If the environment is a jagged, ugly hole, the piece that survives isn't the beautiful, perfect square. It's the jagged, ugly piece that fits.
So our mission for this deep dive is to trace that specific logic. We're going to start with the hard science, genes, diseases, stuff that kills us.
Biology.
Right. And then we're going to take that exact same mechanism and apply it to our governments and our social circles. We are trying to answer a very specific question for you today. Why do disease traits survive in the human body, and why do pathological behaviors like incompetence, cruelty, or bureaucracy thrive in our institutions?
We're going from Richard Dawkins to why your boss might be terrible at their job but keeps getting promoted. And the scary part is it's all the exact same mechanism.
Let's start at the bottom, the biology. Section 1 of our notes here is gene-level selection. We have sources referencing Richard Dawkins and his famous work, The Selfish Gene. Now, this book is obviously famous, but I feel like people often miss the central point because the title sounds, like a metaphor for human selfishness.
They do miss it, yeah. The foundation of this entire argument is that evolution operates at the level of genes, not organisms. This is crucial.
Okay, unpack that.
Well, Dawkins, along with biologists like George C. Williams, popularized the idea that the organism, meaning you, me, the lion, the bacteria, we are the main characters in this story. We are just survival machines.
Which is a pretty humbling way to look at yourself in the mirror. Just a survival machine.
We are temporary vehicles. A gene doesn't care if the vehicle, the human, is happy, fulfilled, or even pain-free. A gene is fit only if it replicates. That is the singular metric.
And the notes call this the goodness fallacy, right?
Exactly, the goodness fallacy. We assume a fit gene makes us better. But a gene can be incredibly successful even if it causes the host absolute suffering, just as long as that suffering doesn't stop it from passing to the next generation.
This is where the research gets super counterintuitive. The notes highlight this concept of value neutrality regarding disease. It basically says that traits we consider defects, things that undeniably make us sick, can actually be adaptive.
Yes, and this is where we have to talk about the heterozygote advantage. It perfectly explains why evolution hasn't wiped out terrible genetic diseases. Take sickle cell anemia.
Right, which is a devastating condition.
It is. If you have 2 copies of the gene, your blood cells are misshapen, it's incredibly painful, and historically it was very often fatal before adulthood.
So if we follow the survival of the strongest logic, natural selection should have deleted that gene thousands of years ago. I mean, it kills the vehicle. Why is it still here?
Because of the environment. If you carry just 1 copy of the sickle cell gene, so you are a carrier, but you don't actually have the full-blown anemia, it turns out you have a massive resistance to malaria.
Wow, that is the trade-off.
Right. In a part of the world where malaria kills millions, being a carrier of a genetic defect isn't a weakness. It is a superpower.
Because the healthy person, the one with perfect blood cells, they die of malaria.
Because the malaria parasite thrives in healthy blood cells. But the person with a genetic defect survives to have children.
And it's not just sickle cell, according to our stack here. The sources mention Tay Sachs and cystic fibrosis, too. So these aren't just random accidents.
The hypothesis is very similar across the board. Tay Sachs carriers might have had resistance to tuberculosis in crowded European ghettos, and cystic fibrosis carriers show resistance to cholera.
So if you're in the middle of a cholera epidemic, the person with the bad gene is the one who lives.
Precisely. It brings us right back to that definition of fitness. It's a cost-benefit analysis. The gene is fit because it keeps the vehicle alive long enough to replicate in that specific dangerous environment. Health in a vacuum just doesn't exist. There's only health in context.
It really reframes how you look at a defect. It's all entirely about the environment you happen to be stuck in.
Which leads us perfectly to the analogies in the source material. Because once you understand this biological logic, that the environment dictates the shape of the winner, you really need a way to visualize it before we switch over to talking about human society.
Yeah, the notes have two analogies here that I think really help land this. The first one is the burning building. And I want to dwell on this for a second because I think it's the absolute key to understanding the rest of the discussion.
Go ahead, paint the picture for us.
Okay, so imagine you were in a burning building. It's chaotic, there's smoke everywhere. But the only way out, the only escape route, is a series of tiny, narrow windows. They're very small, maybe 12 inches wide. Now, usually in a normal world, we'd say the fittest person is the tall, muscular, athletic hero. But in this specific environment, who survives?
The smallest person. The person who might be considered underdeveloped or frail in a normal, everyday context.
Right. Being tall and broad-shouldered is now literally a death sentence. The misfit, the tiny person, is the only one who fits the hole.
And that doesn't mean being tiny is objectively better than being tall. It just means it matches the selection pressure of the burning building. The trait matches the environment.
And the second analogy is even more visceral, the toxic food.
Yeah, this one is a bit disturbing, but it works so well to explain tolerance. Imagine an environment where the only available food is slightly poisonous. It's essentially toxic sludge.
Okay, gross, but I'm with you.
If you have a healthy, sensitive, refined stomach, you will vomit up the food and you will starve. Your body correctly identifies it as poison. But if you have a diseased digestive system, maybe one that is numb or somehow incapable of rejecting toxins, you can keep the food down.
So the person with the iron stomach, or really the broken stomach, outcompetes the healthy person.
Exactly. The disease of tolerating toxins becomes the core strategy for survival.
And this is the pivot point of our deep dive today. Because if this logic holds true for genes and malaria and for burning buildings, what happens when we apply it to human behavior? What happens when the environment isn't a swamp full of mosquitoes, but a corporate office or a political system?
This is where we move from biology to sociology. And the sources here are fascinating because they argue that human society works the exact same way. The environment always defines the hero.
Let's talk about brutality then. Section 3 is brutality and social selection. We have a quote here referencing Ayn Rand. Now, usually, when people bring up Rand, it instantly turns into a political debate. But here, regardless of your politics, we're just looking at her observation of a structural mechanism, right?
Right. We are impartially looking at the claim. Regardless of how you feel about her philosophy, the observation the source pulls out is incredibly sharp. She noted that in a system where brutality is the currency, the murderer outcompetes the pickpocket.
Man, that's a heavy image.
It's the burning building logic again. If the environment rewards violence, if violence is the literal hole you have to fit through, then the most violent person is the fittest. It's not about morality. It never was. It's about the currency of the system.
The notes also bring in Robert Sapolsky and Richard Wrangham here. They study primates and human evolution. How does this connect to our polite office jobs?
Well, they look at hierarchies of stress and conflict. Wrangham documents how environments of chronic conflict select for what's called coalitional aggression. Basically, if you are in a state of constant war, the nice, cooperative, peaceful individuals just get wiped out.
They're the healthy stomachs rejecting the poison, and they starve.
Exactly. And Sapolsky shows that in stress-structured hierarchies, like baboon troops, or perhaps certain high-pressure investment banks, pathological dominance becomes a reproductive advantage. You don't win by being smart or kind. You win by being the most aggressive source of stress for everyone else.
So survival of the fittest in a brutal world literally means survival of the most brutal. The trait that looks like a total pathology in a polite society like uncontrollable aggression is the sickle cell protection of a violent society.
But most of us listening aren't living in a war zone or a baboon troop. We're living in modern, civilized societies We work in offices with HR departments. We deal with government bureaucracies. Surely the selection pressure is different there.
You definitely hope so. But this is where the deep dive gets into institutions as artificial selection. The argument here is that our modern institutions, schools, governments, massive corporations, are artificial environments that create their own weird selection pressures. And they're not necessarily selecting for the best people.
This section references James C. Scott and the concept of legibility. This is a critical concept to understand if you want to know why large organizations act so stupidly sometimes.
I really love this concept, but let's clarify it because legibility usually just means having good handwriting. What does Scott actually mean by it?
Scott argues that states, large corporations, and big systems just fundamentally hate complexity. Complexity is hard to manage. It's hard to tax. It's hard to police. It's hard to measure in a spreadsheet. So systems reward legibility. They want people and data that are easy to read, easy to categorize, and very easy to manage.
Can you give us a concrete example of that?
Sure. Think of a scientifically managed forest. A natural forest is incredibly complex. There's this chaos, underbrush, dozens of different species. It's hard to count the lumber, so the state comes in, cuts it down, and plants neat rows of identical pine trees. That is legible, it's easy to count, it's easy to manage.
But it's also way less resilient to disease.
Exactly. But the system prefers the simple, readable failure over the complex success. Now apply that same logic to employees. They don't want the genius who reinvents the wheel every Tuesday.
Because that person is annoying to a bureaucracy. They disrupt the flow. The system wants the person who follows the form, checks the box, and doesn't ask any questions.
So the system actively selects against complexity and independence. It wants low-variance behavior.
And this connects perfectly to Michel Foucault, who is also in our stack today. And again, regardless of where you fall on the political spectrum with Foucault, the sources highlight his concept of regimes of truth. He essentially argues that institutions don't reward virtue or intelligence. They reward docility. They reward conformity.
This is that lingering feeling of internalized surveillance, that feeling that you always have to be behaving because someone might be watching, or because you need to hit a specific metric this quarter.
Precisely. And if you are the type of person who is naturally docile, compliant, and happy to fill out forms all day long, you are fit for that environment. You fit the hole.
Even if the form is completely pointless.
Especially if the form is pointless. There's a phrase here from Pierre Bourdieu that I absolutely love, but it's also terrifying. He talks about mental miniaturization.
It is a striking phrase.
It sounds like a sci-fi weapon, but he's actually talking about what you do to your own brain just to fit in.
Think about it. If a field, say a specific academic department or a rigid corporate ladder, rewards small-mindedness, if it rewards focusing on tiny procedural details rather than the big picture, then shrinking your mind becomes the adaptive strategy.
You literally shrink yourself to fit the window, just like the burning building.
You miniaturize your intellect. You stop asking, why are we doing this? And you only ask, how do I fill out this form correctly? The person who refuses to miniaturize their mind, the person who keeps asking the big questions, gets pushed out. They are the misfit.
This reminds me so much of David Graeber's work on bullshit jobs, which is also heavily referenced here. He makes the point that bureaucracies often reward outright incompetence.
It's the risk aversion factor. If you are incompetent but fiercely loyal, and you never rock the boat, you stabilize the hierarchy. You are safe. The best employee, the one who is super competent, efficient, and points out all the flaws in the system, is actually a threat. They are too disruptive.
So the incompetent person survives the corporate ladder, and the brilliant person gets fired.
Because the brilliant person didn't fit the hole. The hole was shaped for mediocrity.
This is strangely validating, but also terrifying. It explains why so many people feel like they're losing their minds at work. They're trying to squeeze a complex mind into a highly legible hole.
And it forces us to look at leadership entirely differently, too.
Right, let's go one step darker. Section 5, the pathology of power. We've talked about compliance and mediocrity, but what about the people at the very top, the people running these systems?
This brings us right back to the idea of disease. The sources ask a really fundamental question here. Is the desire for power over others a good trait?
Most of us would say, probably not. Like, wanting to control people is usually a massive red flag in a friend or a partner.
Right. And the source material, drawing on Nietzsche and Christopher Lasch, argues that the desire for authority is actually a disease. It is maladaptive for human flourishing.
Maladaptive, meaning it's bad for us as a species to have people who are obsessed with power running the show.
Correct. Christopher Lasch argues that narcissism is an adaptation to institutional incentives. If you create an institution that heavily rewards self-promotion, a lack of empathy, and pure domination, then narcissism becomes the fit trait.
Oh, wow. We are back to the sickle cell analogy.
We are. Just as the sickle cell trait is a biological response to malaria, power-seeking and narcissism are behavioral responses to pathological institutions.
That is a massive connection.
Think about it. If you are in a cooperative, healthy community, the person who constantly wants to dominate everyone is an outcast. They are the problem. But if you are in a cutthroat, hierarchical institution, that exact same drive for domination is the ticket to the top.
So power-seeking isn't good or noble leadership. It's just the specific pathology that fits a sick system.
Power-seeking is simply fit for an environment that rewards domination and extraction. It is the toxic stomach for the toxic food.
Wow. So let's try to summarize this because we've covered a ton of ground today. We started with genes.
We did. We established that fitness is just a match between a trait and an environment. A gene that causes a terrible disease can be fit if it protects you from something worse, like malaria.
Then we moved to the burning building. If the window is small, you better be small.
And finally, we looked at our own human society. We saw that if our institutions are designed to reward brutality, compliance, or narcissism, then those are the specific traits that will rise to the top. Not because they are good, but because they fit.
It really changes how you look at the world. When you see a terrible boss or a wildly confusing bureaucracy or a politician who seems completely self-absorbed, you stop asking, how did this happen?
You realize it happened because the system was designed to select for exactly that person.
So what does this all mean for us, for the listener? Because this could sound pretty hopeless.
I don't think it's hopeless at all. I think it's actually clarifying. The most important takeaway from all these sources is that we cannot fix pathological behavior just by blaming individuals. It's so easy to say, oh, that person is just a bad apple. But if the barrel is designed to only preserve bad apples, you will never run out of them.
You have to change the barrel. You have to change the environment.
You have to look at the hole that the piece is trying to fit into. If you want different behavior, if you want a kindness or creativity or true competence, you have to build environments that actively select for those things. You have to build a building with big windows.
That is a very powerful thought. And I think it leaves us with a really provocative question to end on today. We've talked about mental miniaturization and how systems want us to be docile.
Yes.
So here is the question for you, listening right now. If our institutions are currently designed to select for mental miniaturization and docility, what kind of human being are we currently breeding for the future?
That is the ultimate worry. Are we evolving ourselves into a corner?
And on a slightly more personal note, if you feel like you don't fit in at work, if you feel like you're constantly clashing with the bureaucracy or you just can't seem to play the game right.
Maybe that isn't a failure at all. Maybe that is actually a profound compliment to your character.
Maybe you're just the healthy stomach refusing to digest the poison.
I really like that.
That's it for this deep dive. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.